Narrator En. Richard Ashford laid a single sheet of paper on the heavy mahogany table, sliding it toward his daughter without a word. 5 names, 5 fortunes, 5 arranged destinies. Narrator En. Sienna Ashford did not pick up the list. She walked out of the grand dining hall, leaving her father's cold gaze behind as she descended into the basement. Narrator En. Down the long stone staircase, past the locked wine cellar, she stopped at the heavy steel door of the mansion's central boiler room. Narrator En. A man in a grease-stained gray canvas jacket was kneeling beside the old furnace, one hand black with soot, the other steady on a heavy wrench. Narrator En. Tyler Brooks did not look up when the heavy door creaked open. He simply listened to the rhythmic, broken ticking of the massive iron furnace. Narrator En. The boiler room smelled heavily of rust, warm iron, and dry dust. Sienna stayed at the threshold, watching the stranger work with absolute precision. Narrator En. He did not curse, did not check his phone, and did not hurry. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if the metal were a living organism. Narrator En. It has been making a strange sound since yesterday, Sienna said finally, her voice echoing softly against the damp, reinforced concrete walls. Narrator En. I know, Tyler replied without turning around, his voice low, gravelly, and entirely accustomed to the long silence of manual labor. Narrator En. He reached for a smaller brass fitting, his fingers moving with the flat certainty of a man who fixed broken things without asking who owned them. Narrator En. Tyler stood up slowly, knees stiff, taller and leaner than she had anticipated. He methodically folded his grease-stained rag and placed each tool back into its scarred metal container. Narrator En. Beside the rusted workbench sat a child's faded lunchbox and a folded sheet of construction paper. Crayon lines depicted a house, a bright sun, and 2 small figures holding hands. Narrator En. 3 weeks, he answered flatly when she asked of his tenure. He quietly slid the child's drawing and lunchbox into his deep canvas pocket, protecting them from the grime. Narrator En. Margaret, the housekeeper of 31 years, paused briefly at the doorway. Her eyes met Tyler's for a fleeting second, no words were exchanged, yet the silence spoke of deep familiarity. Narrator En. The relief valve will hold for now, Tyler muttered, stepping past her. Replace the entire unit next winter. Do not let them patch it again. He then vanished up the stairs. Narrator En. The following evening, Sienna intercepted him in the stark, white-walled service corridor. The air smelled of wet stone and rain as Tyler stood holding his heavy metallic toolbox. Narrator En. A contract, Sienna proposed coldly. 6 months of paper marriage, 3 corporate appearances, $300,000, and a fully funded college tuition trust for your young daughter. Narrator En. Tyler stopped, his green eyes scanning her with absolute clarity. The corridor was bright, exposing the raw calculation behind her beautiful face as she waited for his predictable agreement. Narrator En. My daughter is not a line item in your contract, Tyler replied, his voice deadly calm. You do not get to secure her future by renting her father's dignity. Narrator En. He walked away without raising his voice, closing the heavy corridor door with a quiet, deliberate finality. Sienna stood alone in the bright, silent space, utterly refused. Narrator En. Late that night, near 11 o'clock, Sienna's personal phone vibrated on the polished marble counter. Margaret's voice broke through the speaker, tight with uncharacteristic panic. Narrator En. A severe respiratory emergency had struck little Grace in the damp chill of the night. Emergency personnel had rushed the child straight to Massachusetts General Hospital. Narrator En. Sienna did not stop to analyze her impulses. She was in her sleek sports car before her cashmere coat was fully pulled over her shoulders. Narrator En. Rain smeared the harbor lights into long, distorted neon streaks across her windshield. The vehicle surged forward through the slick, empty streets of the city. Narrator En. She did not decelerate until the bright red neon sign of the emergency entrance cast a stark crimson glow over her vehicle's wet hood. Narrator EN, the hospital corridor was the sterile white of polished bone. Tyler stood frozen at the central nursing station, both hands flat on the high counter. Narrator EN, he seemed held upright only by the wood beneath his palms. He turned, his exhausted green eyes fixing on Sienna with a mixture of shock and unwelcome intrusion. Narrator EN, Sienna did not offer empty words or plastic comfort. She silently took a seat in a cold plastic chair against the clinical, faded wall. Narrator EN, they sat through the long, freezing hours of the early morning, separated by 4 empty blue seats and an unspoken canyon of unresolved truths. Narrator EN, at 3:45, a nurse beckoned silently from the doorway of room 108. Tyler stood up, his boots making no sound on the worn vinyl floor as he entered. Narrator EN, 20 minutes later, the same nurse returned to the waiting area. "He is asking if you would come in," she whispered to Sienna. Narrator EN, Sienna stood up, smoothing her blonde hair with a sudden, uncharacteristic nervousness. Her hands felt awkward, out of place in this world of quiet suffering. Narrator EN, the room was small and dim. Grace lay under a white sheet, her tiny hand taped securely to a thin intravenous line. Narrator EN, Tyler sat on the very edge of the thin mattress, cradling his daughter's other hand like a man holding a fragile glass artifact. Narrator EN, the little girl's eyes fluttered open, a clear, exhausted blue. She stared at Sienna's face for a long, silent moment before speaking. Narrator EN, you have hair like a fairy, the child whispered, her weak voice barely carrying across the small space between them. Narrator EN, a surprised, rough laugh escaped Sienna's throat before she could stop it. She had forgotten the physical sensation of genuine laughter. Narrator EN, it had been 7 weeks since she last smiled without calculation. The realization hung heavily in the warm, ticking silence of the room. Narrator EN, Sienna moved closer, sitting on a low stool by the window. She picked up a thin, worn book of bedtime stories left on the side table and began to read softly. Narrator EN, when the clinical nursing staff arrived at 6 to check the fluid line, Tyler quietly walked Sienna out into the awakening corridor. Narrator EN, the massive hospital structure was slowly stirring. Metal supply carts rattled distantly, and an old coffee machine sputtered into life in the lounge. Narrator EN, thank you, Tyler said simply, his gravelly voice dropping. He did not offer theatrical gratitude, but his green eyes bore the weight of genuine appreciation. Narrator EN, I am not going to make that offer again, Sienna stated flatly, leaning her broad shoulders against the cool, white-painted corridor wall. Narrator EN, Tyler stood motionless, his sharp jawline tightening as he braced for another transactional corporate manipulation from the billionaire's daughter. Narrator EN, give me a real reason instead, she continued, her blue eyes locking onto his with absolute sincerity. Something I can declare to my father. Narrator EN, stand beside me for 1 month, she proposed. No cash, no legal trusts, no paperwork. Let him believe you are an unyielding force in my life. Narrator EN, Tyler remained silent, looking through the narrow glass window at his sleeping daughter, whose fragile breath moved the white cotton sheet. Narrator EN, if we fail, we sever all ties cleanly, Sienna added. But if you refuse, the man my father chose will dismantle your former industry completely. Narrator EN, Tyler watched the steady, rhythmic ticking of the medical monitors. After a long, heavy silence, he gave a single, decisive nod of agreement. Narrator EN, Friday arrived far quicker than either of them anticipated. Tyler Brooks pulled up to the massive iron gates of the Ashford estate. Narrator EN, he wore a dark, structured suit that was nearly 10 years out of fashion. The fabric was stiff, meticulously pressed that very afternoon. Narrator Ian, his heavy work boots had been scuffed but shined to a dull gloss. He stepped out onto the damp gravel driveway, his posture straight. Narrator Ian, Tyler held little Grace's small hand securely in his own. The child wore a simple navy blue dress with a spotless, crisp white collar. Narrator Ian, Grace looked up at the towering brick mansion, her innocent eyes wide, as if she had inadvertently wandered into a historic museum.
You must understand that true power is never given, it is simply taken. This entire estate is merely a testament to that fact.
Narrator Ian, the old Typhiat's gaze dropped to the worn leather of Tyler's shined shoes. His mouth did not move, but a tight muscle in his sharp jaw twitched. Narrator Ian, Mr. Brooks, Richard said coldly, his deep voice bouncing off the stone. He did not bend down to acknowledge the child standing beside him. Narrator Ian, Grace looked up at the towering older man, then back at her father's calm face, before uttering a quiet, polite, "Good evening, sir." Narrator Ian, Sienna descended the long, sweeping marble staircase alone. She did not take Tyler's arm, she stood half a step behind his shoulder, letting him stand entirely on his own strength. Narrator Ian, Julian Drake was already waiting in the massive, high-ceilinged dining hall. He was 44, posture perfect, bearing the easy smile of a man who had never been told no. Narrator Ian, he stood up smooth and unhurried as they entered, holding out his hand to Tyler with a calculated grip meant to establish immediate social dominance. Narrator Ian, Julian Drake, Chief Operating Officer, he introduced himself with practiced warmth, his blue eyes scanning Tyler's outdated attire with clinical amusement. Narrator Ian, and what is it you do exactly, Mr. Brooks? Julian asked, his voice dripping with an insincere politeness that signaled an oncoming psychological ambush. Narrator Ian, building maintenance, Tyler answered without a single flinch. Hourly rate, salaried through an external engineering contractor. Narrator Ian, how much, if you don't mind the directness? Julian inquired further. The massive mahogany table went entirely still, the serving staff paused in the shadows. Narrator Ian, Sienna's fingers tightened visibly on the carved wooden back of her chair, her blue eyes narrowing as she witnessed the raw corporate cruelty unfold. Narrator Ian, 42,000 a year, Tyler replied, his gravelly voice flat and steady. Plus comprehensive health insurance coverage for my daughter. Narrator Ian, Julian let out a short, soft, terrible laugh that echoed slightly against the stone walls. Well, at the very least, that is remarkably honest. Narrator Ian, dinner was served in an oppressive, ringing silence. Little Grace sat quietly between her father and Sienna, using her heavy silver fork with extreme, meticulous care. Narrator Ian, halfway through the secondary course, Grace reached carefully for her crystal glass of dark grape juice. Narrator Ian, her small, slight elbow caught the intricate rim. Dark purple liquid bloomed instantly across the immaculate white linen tablecloth. Narrator Ian, the heavy stain ran rapidly along the edge, dripping directly onto the pale gray sleeve of Julian Drake's bespoke tailored suit. Narrator Ian, Julian stood up abruptly, his chair scraping violently backward against the stone. His face hardened into raw, unrestrained fury. Narrator Ian, for God's sake, I'm sorry, little Grace whispered, her small face turning completely crimson as she shrank back into her seat. Narrator Ian, Tyler was already on one knee on the concrete floor beside her chair, completely ignoring the billionaire's outrage as he attended to his child. Narrator Ian, it is okay, sweetheart. It is just juice, Tyler murmured, his voice steady, low, and completely unbothered by the powerful men staring down at him. Narrator Ian, it is a custom fabric, Julian snapped. Sienna looked directly at her father and cut through the noise, it is just a sleeve, Julian. Narrator Ian, Richard Ashford set his silver glass down slowly, his calculating eyes shifting from the man on one knee to his daughter's unyielding face. Narrator EN, Mr. Brooks, Richard Ashford spoke, his deep voice carrying a flat, absolute authority that immediately commanded the large, silent room. Narrator EN, 1 month, the old billionaire declared, extending a single, wrinkled finger toward the handsome mechanic standing beside the child. Narrator EN, you will prove to me that there is something behind your quiet confidence worthy of my daughter's heritage and name. Narrator EN, or you will walk out of these grand stone gates permanently, and you will never return. Are we entirely clear? Narrator EN, yes, sir, Tyler answered without a single trace of hesitation, his green eyes meeting the old man's gaze with flat equality. Narrator EN, good. Let us toast to a month of absolute clarity, Richard added, raising his silver wine chalice. No one else moved their glass. Narrator EN, early the following morning, Sienna stood in her luxurious suite, methodically packing 2 heavy leather suitcases with essential attire. Narrator EN, by late afternoon, she was personally carrying the luggage up a narrow, creaking wooden staircase in an old neighborhood across town. Narrator EN, the humble apartment sat directly above an active bakery on Hanover Street. The entire structure smelled constantly of warm yeast and fresh bread. Narrator EN, little Grace stood waiting on the small wooden landing, holding the heavy entry door open with a bright, welcoming smile. Narrator EN, that very evening, Sienna stood before a though mock porcelain sink, watching warm water and lemon-scented soap foam flow over her bare hands. Narrator EN, she had never washed a dish in her entire adult life. She observed her own fingers moving with something closely resembling silent wonder. Narrator EN, Tyler Brooks stood at the small gas stove, methodically preparing a simple dinner of pasta with melted butter, garlic, and fresh lemon zest. Narrator EN, a single, warm yellow hanging lamp illuminated the small wooden table where little Grace sat patiently between them, humming a quiet melody. Narrator EN, they ate slowly and in relative silence, yet Sienna felt an unfamiliar, profound sensation of receiving something she had not commercially earned. Narrator EN, after the plates were cleared, Grace pulled out a battered tin of crayons, laying a single blank sheet of construction paper between them. Narrator EN, you draw the sky, Mommy Sienna, the child instructed with absolute seriousness. I will handle the people. Everyone can draw a sky. Narrator EN, Sienna picked up a blue crayon, her fingers slightly unsteady as she drew a clumsy, unpracticed line across the top of the white page. Narrator EN, later that night, after Grace had fallen asleep, Sienna went searching through the deep hallway closet for an extra cotton blanket. Narrator EN, on the top shelf, behind a stack of neatly folded plain towels, her fingers brushed against a heavy, dented metal filing case. Narrator EN, Sienna carefully lowered the heavy metallic case to the old hardwood floor of the dim hallway, her heart rate accelerating slightly. Narrator EN, the worn silver latch gave way with a sharp, echoing metallic click that cut cleanly through the deep midnight silence. Narrator EN, inside lay thick stacks of official federal patents, intricate mechanical schematics, and a heavily bound report bearing a prominent government seal. Narrator EN, the name printed across every single engineering cover page was completely identical, E. Carter, Principal Engineer, Geothermal Systems. Narrator EN, the most recent document was precisely dated 3 years and 4 months ago, the exact timeline of the project's sudden, quiet death. Narrator EN, Sienna scanned the complex mathematical variables and thermal formulas, her sharp mind realizing the immense scope of the data. Narrator EN, the man asleep in the small adjoining room was not a common mechanic, he was a disgraced energy pioneer ham high by his own industry. Narrator EN, she carefully slid the heavy filings back into the case, smoothing the stacked towels to ensure absolutely no trace of her intrusion remained. Narrator EN, across town, inside the stark corporate offices of the Ashford Holdings Tower, Julian Drake stood leaning over a massive glass desk. Narrator EN, pull every archived engineering file we have on Tyler Brooks, Julian ordered the records director, his cold face mapping total corporate malice. Narrator EN, the records director hesitated briefly, his eyes darting to the secure storage terminal. That specific archive is sealed, sir, he murmured. Narrator EN, I am unsealing it tonight, Julian countered, his voice dripping with absolute executive privilege as he tapped his fingers on the cold frame. Narrator EN, print the master file manually. Walk it straight to my office, and ensure absolutely nothing touches the shared corporate network drive. Narrator EN, within 40 minutes, Julian sat under a sharp desk lamp, methodically reviewing the physical pages of Tyler Brooks' suppressed engineering career. Narrator EN, a dark, calculating smile spread slowly across his sharp face features as he discovered the hidden metadata of his own past involvement. Narrator EN, he picked up his secure mobile phone, dialing an unlisted number with the flat certainty of an executive launching a hostile asset management play. Narrator EN, we need to advance the SAP-NAP timeline immediately, Julian ordered his contact across town, his voice echoing in the empty, glass-walled office. Narrator EN, and hire a private investigator. I want a complete tactical log of the mechanic's daughter, her elementary school, and her exact route home. Narrator EN, the cold corporate warfare across town felt entirely distant inside the small GAC my apartment on Hanover Street the following morning. Narrator EN, sunlight filtered through the worn glass window pane, illuminating the dark wooden table where a fresh sheet of paper lay spread open. Narrator EN, little Grace sat perfectly straight, her small fingers guiding Sienna's elegant hand as it held a dull blue wax crayon. Narrator EN, press softly, Mommy Sienna, that is the rule for the sunset, the child instructed, her voice filled with sweet, innocent authority. Narrator EN, Sienna adjusted her grip on the cheap toy sap, her piercing blue eyes softening with a genuine warmth she had never experienced. Narrator EN, she dragged the blue wax down to meet a layer of pale pink, watching the colors blend smoothly across the rough grain texture. Narrator EN, Tyler Brooks stood silently beside the porcelain sink, glancing over his broad shoulder at the two figures focused entirely on the page. Narrator EN, a rare, subtle movement at the corner of his sharp jawline betrayed a faint, genuine smile that vanished almost instantly. Narrator EN, the apartment was quiet, filled completely with the rich, comforting fragrance of warm yeast and fresh bread baking on the lower floor. Narrator EN, 3 days later, Sienna returned to the massive Ashford estate on a morning when Tyler had taken little Grace to her elementary school. Narrator EN, she bypassed the main living areas, stepping quietly into the expansive, sunlit kitchen where Margaret was methodically folding linen towels. Narrator EN, Sienna sat down on a high wooden counter stool without asking for permission, her face serious, her intent entirely focused. Narrator EN, tell me about him, Margaret, she requested, her clear blue eyes locking onto the older woman's weathered, kind face. Narrator EN, Margaret paused her movements, setting the tea towel down on the marble surface with a slow, heavy sigh of deep reluctance. Narrator EN, he led the geothermal energy project 3 years ago, Margaret whispered, her voice low to prevent echoing down the grand stone halls. Narrator EN, it was the massive initiative designed to transition Ashford Holdings completely away from legacy oil investments for good. Narrator EN, the board pulled the funding after a second set of technical metrics reported a total system failure, the older woman explained.
They told me to wait here until the signal changed. But the signal never changes. Nothing ever changes in this house.
Narrator EN, she placed it on the counter between them, the first signature line was the executive sponsor, Brendan Lockcatch. Narrator EN, Sienna stared at the yellowed sheet for a long time, her fingers cold against the ceramic cup as the gardener's rake scraped rhythmically outside. Narrator En, why didn't you say anything before? Sienna demanded. Because I am the housekeeper, and because Mr. Brooks asked me explicitly not to. Narrator En, he told me the project was over, Margaret sighed. He said the only entity that mattered now was his young child's safety. Narrator En, Sienna folded the cancellation order with meticulous, sharp care, sliding the proof into her deep trench coat pocket. Narrator En, that very night, she sat across from Tyler at the small kitchen table. Little Grace was already asleep, and the street below had fallen completely dark. Narrator En, I know everything, she stated flatly. Tyler understood her implication instantly, his facial features did not shift into false denial. Narrator En, I buried that career on purpose, he replied, his intense green eyes looking down at his large, though wrapped palms resting on the wood. Narrator En, I do not want that corporate life back. I want to raise my daughter, fix furnaces, and sleep at night without warfare. Narrator En, I am not asking you to fight him, Sienna answered softly, placing the folded document flat on the table. I just believed you deserved to know what was true. Narrator En, Tyler looked down at the folded paper page on the dark wood, his broad shoulders staying completely motionless for a long, heavy minute. Narrator En, he slowly extended his scarred right hand across the narrow table width, his rough fingers contacting hers with a deliberate, firm hold. Narrator En, he did not speak a single word, yet the flat certainty of his physical grip signaled a silent, unyielding alliance that needed no commercial clauses. Narrator En, the heavy wood door of the small bedroom creaked softly open behind them. Little Grace walked out into the dim kitchen corridor in her cotton pajamas. Narrator En, good night, my mommy Sienna, the girl whispered softly, wrapping her thin, delicate arms tightly around the elegant blonde woman's neck. Narrator En, Sienna closed her piercing blue eyes instantly, her chest tightening as she pulled the small, fragile frame into her own protective embrace. Narrator En, Tyler Brooks stood silently in the kitchen doorway structure, his broad silhouette framed completely by the low yellow ambient light bulb glow. Narrator En, for the first time in 3 long, bitter years, his intense green eyes filled slowly with a wave of raw, genuine emotion that he did not try to wipe away. Narrator En, the room fell back into a serene midnight stillness, the ancient radiator unit ticking rhythmically as the new family bond solidified in the darkness. Narrator En, the tranquility of Hanover Street was abruptly shattered 3 days later inside a cold, unmarked surveillance vehicle parked down the alley. Narrator En, a hired operative sat motionless in the dark interior, his hands adjusting the heavy lens of a long-range digital camera. Narrator En, through the crosshairs of the viewfinder, little Grace appeared on the sidewalk, holding her father's hand as they walked toward school. Narrator En, the shutter clicked rapidly and silently, capturing her innocent face, her navy blue dress, and the exact street coordinates of her morning path. Narrator En, every tactical movement, every civilian intersection, and every precise arrival time was logged directly into a secure digital dossier. Narrator En, at 3:15 that afternoon, the same unmarked vehicle lingered across the street from the historic brick elementary school gate.
The police are coming. You have to leave the house immediately and don't look back.
Narrator En, a sequence of high-definition surveillance photographs mapped her entire route home, creating a precise timeline of vulnerability. Narrator En, the encrypted tracking file was uploaded instantly to a private, non-attributable server partition across town. Narrator En, inside the high-ceilinged boardroom of Ashford Holdings, a notification chimed softly on Julian Drake's personal desktop terminal. Narrator En, Julian Drake scrolled slowly through the high-definition thumbnails, his eyes tracking the child's small silhouette against the brick background. Narrator En, she caught a glimpse of a printed transit itinerary sheet left open on the central fax scanner, bearing Grace's name and school hours. Narrator EN. Margaret stepped carefully into the shadows of the empty walk-in pantry, her hands trembling as she pulled out her personal phone. Narrator EN. At 11:40 that night, the sharp ringtone shattered the peaceful, warm silence of the small Hanover Street GACMI. Narrator EN. Sienna answered on the very first ring, her posture rigid as Margaret's panicked voice broke through the line with absolute urgency. Narrator EN. He has hired professional surveillance, Margaret whispered, her voice shaking. They are tracking the child's exact route home from school. Narrator EN. Sienna, you need to get ahead of this tactical manipulation tonight before the upcoming boardroom presentation on Friday. Narrator EN. Sienna set the phone down slowly, her piercing blue eyes locking onto Tyler, whose calm facial features instantly hardened into ice. Narrator EN. Sienna arrived at the dark base of the Ashford Holdings Tower at precisely 2:15 the following morning, her steps rapid and silent. Narrator EN. She bypassed the main security lobby, utilizing the vintage master credentials inherited directly from her late grandfather. Narrator EN. The heavy electronic security terminal blinked green instantly, releasing the locking mechanism of the restricted records archive floor. Narrator EN. The cavernous basement archive was cold, filled completely with row after row of rolling steel storage shelving units. Narrator EN. Sienna sat before the unmonitored master catalog terminal, her fingers flying across the keys as she initialized a deep database search. Narrator EN. She located the original geothermal technical file partition, the raw, unedited review metrics before Julian Drake's manipulation. Narrator EN. The system metrics proved that Tyler's pilot site had outperformed corporate projections by exactly 11% across all seasons. Narrator EN. She unlayered the subsequent data updates, exposing the falsified loan numbers and the electronic metadata signature of Julian's account. Narrator EN. A secure financial tracking log confirmed a wire transfer of $16 million from a shell entity owned by Westcott Petroleum. Narrator EN. Sienna printed every single string of evidence, packing the physical documents into a banker's box as the copier hummed in the darkness. Narrator EN. Sienna personally carried the heavy box of evidence up the steep stairs, placing it flat onto the scratched kitchen table with a dull thud. Narrator EN. Tyler Brooks emerged from little Grace's room, his bare feet silent on the floorboards as he stared intensely at the box. Narrator EN. He sat down slowly across from it, his large hands resting on the cardboard lid for a long time before he finally lifted it off. Narrator EN. He read his own suppressed engineering work back to himself for the first time in 3 bitter, exhausting years. Narrator EN. His fingers were slightly unsteady as he turned a dense layout sheet, his intense green eyes widening under the amber lamplight. Narrator EN. Deep within the technical binder, he found a margins page that he had not reviewed since his sudden, forced corporate exile. Narrator EN. She used to sketch on my draft files, Tyler whispered softly, his gravelly voice dropping into a rare, emotional vulnerability. Narrator EN. Whenever I brought work home, she told me that the complex engineering felt lonely without something soft drawn on it. Narrator EN. Sienna watched his face silently from across the table, realizing that the unyielding ice inside his soul had finally melted completely. Narrator EN. Friday arrived with a sharp, crystal coldness that mirrored the absolute tactical calculation of the two allied figures. Narrator EN. Inside the grand ballroom of the Boston Harbor Hotel, 400 prominent investors and observers sat beneath towering chandeliers. Narrator EN. The expansive room was ruck-RO with high-contrast flashbulbs and news cameras aligned perfectly along the rear media deck. Narrator EN. On the prominent display stage, ice sculptures carved intricately into the corporate monogram were already beginning to weep. Narrator EN. Richard Ashford stood rigid at the central wooden lectern, adjusting his dark navy suit as he prepared to announce the sap nap. Narrator En, Julian Drake stood precisely 3 feet to his right, bearing the untouchable, smug smile of an executive who believed he had won. Narrator En, good evening, Richard's deep voice boomed cleanly through the microphones. Tonight, Ashford Holdings officially announces. Narrator En, excuse me, father, a clear, authoritative female voice cut cleanly through the acoustics, shattering the structured presentation instantly. Narrator En, the heavy double doors at the side entrance swung wide open as Sienna Ashford stepped onto the polished parquet floor. Narrator En, Tyler Brooks walked directly behind her, his broad shoulders squared inside a perfectly tailored dark suit, carrying a slim leather folio. Narrator En, Sienna Ashford walked up the side stairs of the main stage, her stride smooth and unbothered by the hundreds of staring eyes. Narrator En, she did not ask for permission, she stood directly at the central wooden lectern as her father stepped back in stunned confusion. Narrator En, Tyler Brooks positioned himself half a step behind her right shoulder, connecting his slim leather folio to the podium data console interface. Narrator En, the massive LED presentation screen behind them flickered instantly, replacing the corporate merger slides with a stark data layout grid. Narrator En, would like 5 minutes before this company announces anything irreversible, Sienna's clear voice resounded powerfully through the ballroom. Narrator En, on the immense digital screen, Tyler's original geothermal technical review metrics appeared side by side with Julian Drake's falsified reports. Narrator En, the encrypted electronic metadata trails, transfer dates, and the specific Shell account records were exposed completely to the entire audience. Narrator En, this is the clean technical data that was intentionally suppressed 3 years ago, she declared, her blue eyes tracking Julian's pale face. Narrator En, and these are the digital signatures tracking a wire transfer of $16 million directly into a trust managed under Julian's middle name. Narrator En, a sudden, deafening wave of applause broke out from the technical investment sector, completely validating the return genius. Narrator En, Tyler Brooks stepped forward to the central wooden lectern, his broad frame dominating the bright stage as Sienna smoothly transitioned to his side. Narrator En, he tapped the microphone once, the low, resonant thud instantly commanding the packed room of 400 whispering shareholders. Narrator En, the core problem was never a system failure, Tyler's deep, gravelly voice echoed cleanly through the ballroom with absolute engineering authority. Narrator En, the pressure parameters at the Massachusetts pilot site were intentionally manipulated by an external administrative command loop. Narrator En, he touched the console interface, displaying a complex fluid dynamics flow chart that illuminated the entire rear LED screen. Narrator En, the relief valves were programmed to trigger prematurely at exactly 42% of their actual structural thermal capacity. Narrator En, a row of senior institutional investors in the front row leaned forward sharply, their analytical eyes scanning the flawless mathematics. Narrator En, the system is functional, clean, and fully prepared for commercial deployment, Tyler stated flatly, looking directly at Richard Ashford. Narrator En, it requires no oil legacy subsidies, no corporate inflation, and zero administrative compromises to secure the region's energy grid. Narrator En, the applause died down into an eerie, suffocating silence as the ballroom doors were pushed open by 2 federal agents in dark tactical windbreakers. Narrator En, Richard Ashford remained at the lectern, his face turning an ashen, ghostly pale as the agents walked directly toward Julian Drake. Narrator En, Julian stood frozen, the smug mask of corporate invincibility shattering completely as the heavy steel cuffs were produced. Narrator En, Julian Drake, you are under arrest for corporate fraud, wire embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit industrial sabotage, the lead agent declared. Narrator En, the ballroom floor echoed with the sharp, metallic snap of the handcuffs securing Julian's wrists behind his back. Narrator EN, news cameras from the rear deck swiveled toward the stage, capturing the raw, humiliated fall of a billionaire operative. Narrator EN, Richard Ashford looked toward Sienna, his eyes finally registering the magnitude of the daughter he had almost sacrificed for a criminal. Narrator EN, Tyler stood his ground, his gaze unwavering as he watched Julian being led away past the rows of stunned investors. Narrator EN, Sienna stepped forward, taking her father's hand off the microphone and addressing the shareholders with calm, final authority. Narrator EN, effective immediately, the board initiates an independent audit of all Ashford holdings, starting with the Julian Drake department. Narrator EN, the storm of corporate scandal lingered in the city, but inside the small apartment on Hanover Street, the atmosphere remained hushed and sacred. Narrator EN, Sienna entered the familiar, cramped space, no longer carrying the weight of a billionaire heiress, but the quiet exhaustion of a survivor. Narrator EN, Tyler stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker like distant embers, his posture finally devoid of its defensive, jagged edges. Narrator EN, he turned slowly as she entered, his gaze softening not with the recognition of a boss, but with the quiet clarity of an equal. Narrator EN, little Grace had fallen asleep at the kitchen table, her head resting on a crayon-colored drawing of 3 stick figures standing together. Narrator EN, Sienna walked over, her fingers tracing the air above the child's drawing, her heart swelling with a warmth she had once thought unreachable. Narrator EN, I've started the audit, Sienna murmured, her voice barely a breath. The energy grid transition will be fully funded by next fiscal year. Narrator EN, Tyler stepped closer, his presence warm and steady, placing a hand gently over hers on the weathered surface of the wooden table. Narrator EN, in the soft, golden light of the apartment, the boundaries between the legacy of the Ashford Empire and the quiet life of the mechanic dissolved. Narrator EN, for the first time, they sat together in the silence of the night, not as business associates, but as two people finally standing on level ground. Narrator EN, Saturday morning light hit the mirror, reflecting a Sienna Ashford no longer clad in silk, but in simple, sturdy fabrics that mirrored her new resolve. Narrator EN, she adjusted her collar with precise, steady movements, looking not at the heiress in the glass, but at the reformer she had become. Narrator EN, Tyler stood by the doorway, his own transition from work-worn canvas to a sharp, modern suit complete, watching her with profound, silent support. Narrator EN, he held the car keys, not to a luxury limousine, but to a reliable, fuel-efficient sedan, ready for their return to the estate. Narrator EN, the board is expecting a capitulation, Sienna noted, her voice cold as steel. They will receive a structural transformation instead. Narrator EN, they walked down the stairs of the Hanover building, the scent of the bakery below clinging to their clothes like a badge of honest work. Narrator EN, Grace waved from the landing, her small hand steady, trusting her father's promise that this absence would be brief and necessary. Narrator EN, the ride to the Ashford estate was quiet, each mile marker a reminder of how far the distance between the Empire and the truth had narrowed. Narrator EN, as the iron gates loomed ahead, Sienna looked at the massive complex, seeing it for the first time as a system to be healed, not a trophy to be owned. Narrator EN, she reached for Tyler's hand, a tactile anchor before stepping back into the lion's den to reclaim the company's future for the people. Narrator EN, the Ashford boardroom was a cavern of polished mahogany and absolute, suffocating corporate tradition. Narrator EN, Richard Ashford sat at the head of the long, dark table, his face a mask of iron as the board members gathered. Narrator EN, Sienna stepped into the room with Tyler, the weight of the banker's box held firmly in her grasp. Narrator EN, this meeting is regarding the finalized sell-off of our legacy oil sector, Richard announced, his voice echoing with practiced coldness. Narrator EN, Sienna did not wait for the formal vote, she opened the banker's box and spilled the documents across the center table. Narrator EN, there will be no sell-off, she declared, her blue eyes scanning the room of terrified executives. There will be an immediate pivot. Narrator EN, The engineering data provided here confirms that Ashford Holdings is currently sitting on a geothermal gold mine. Narrator Ian, Richard's face turned white as he stared at the falsified metrics that had been used to bankrupt his own legacy project. Narrator Ian, any director who votes to continue this deception will be named as a co-conspirator in the upcoming federal audit. Narrator Ian, the room exploded into shouting, but Sienna held her ground, her voice ringing out above the chaos like a gavel. Narrator Ian, the hum of the city market finally faded as Sienna and Tyler ascended the creaking stairs of the Hanover building, their pace slow and deliberate. Narrator Ian, they entered the small GAC my apartment to find Grace awake, sitting on the rug with a storybook open on her lap. Narrator Ian, the child looked up, her blue eyes wide as she saw the change in her father's posture. The tension of 3 years had simply evaporated. Narrator Ian, Sienna knelt on the wooden floor, pulling the child into an embrace that felt, for the first time, entirely permanent and unburdened. Narrator Ian, Tyler Brooks stood silently in the kitchen doorway structure, watching his daughter and the woman who had risked everything to restore their family's honor. Narrator Ian, he walked over to the small kitchen table, setting down the heavy, empty banker's box that had been their weapon of truth. Narrator Ian, they are already drafting the board resignation papers for the remaining Julian Drake cohorts, Sienna reported, her voice light and unhurried. Narrator Ian, Tyler took a seat, his rugged hands relaxed for the first time in an eternity, listening to her recount the crumbling of the corporate wall. Narrator Ian, Grace crawled up into Tyler's lap, grabbing a crayon to finish the stick figure drawing they had started days before. Narrator Ian, the kitchen lamp cast a warm, golden glow over the three of them, a portrait of a fractured past finally healing into a cohesive, quiet future. Narrator Ian, 6 months of rigorous reconstruction had transformed the abandoned site into a humming, clean energy hub for western Massachusetts. Narrator Ian, the morning of the public unveiling arrived, with hundreds of technicians and state officials gathered under the crisp, bright sky. Narrator Ian, she wore a simple, light-colored blazer, a stark contrast to the heavy dark suits she had once worn in the boardroom. Narrator Ian, Tyler Brooks walked toward the podium, carrying himself with the easy, unburdened grace of a man fully at peace with his work. Narrator Ian, little Grace clung to his hand, looking around at the state-of-the-art turbines with a wide, proud smile for her father.